On a cold December morning in 1831, a narrow country lane near Carrickshock in County Kilkenny became the scene of sudden and shocking violence. What began as a routine legal exercise, the serving of tithe notices under police escort, ended within minutes with 14 members of the enforcement party lying dead and the authority of the state badly shaken. The Carrickshock incident was the bloodiest episode of the Tithe War, and it crystallized years of rural resentment into a single, unforgettable confrontation. Though brief, the clash revealed how fragile law and order had become in large parts of Ireland, and how deeply unpopular the system it sought to enforce really was. The conflict at Carrickshock cannot be understood without first explaining tithes themselves. For centuries, tithes were a levy on agricultural produce, notionally 1/10, intended to support the established church. In Ireland, that church was the Church of Ireland, a Protestant institution serving a small minority of the population. By the early 19th century, most Irish people were Roman Catholic, yet they remained legally obliged to fund a church they did not attend and often actively resented. By this period, tithes were usually collected in cash rather than crops, but the burden they represented was no less real for small tenant farmers living close to subsistence. Tithes were not merely an economic grievance. They symbolized religious inequality, political subordination, and the survival of an older Protestant ascendancy in a changing Ireland. Payment was enforced regardless of harvest conditions, and arrears could lead to the seizure of cattle, crops, or household goods. The system fell most heavily on those least able to pay, while wealthier landholders often avoided the worst effects. As economic conditions tightened in the late 1820s, resentment hardened into open defiance. That defiance erupted in 1831 into what became known as the Tithe War. Across rural Ireland, communities organized to resist payment collectively. Rather than isolated refusals, farmers acted together, ensuring that enforcement became a public spectacle. When tithe proctors or process servers appeared, church bells were rung and horns blown to summon crowds. Livestock seizures were obstructed, auctions disrupted, and those who cooperated with the authorities were socially ostracized. Much of this resistance was non-violent, but it carried an unmistakable threat. The state increasingly relied on armed police escorts, and every confrontation risked turning deadly. It was against this background that the events at Carrickshock unfolded. On the 14th of December, 1831, a small party of Irish constabulary led by Captain James Gibbons escorted a process server who was attempting to serve tithe notices on behalf of a local Church of Ireland clergyman. As word spread, large numbers of local people gathered ahead of the party's route. The encounter took place in a narrow boreen flanked by high stone walls, a setting that left the police hemmed in and exposed. Tensions escalated rapidly. A young man rushed forward and was shot and bayoneted, and Captain Gibbons ordered his men to fire. The crowd responded with overwhelming force, using sticks, stones, hurleys, and farm implements. Within minutes, the enforcement party had been overrun. When the violence subsided, 14 members of the constabulary party, including Gibbons and the process server, were dead. 3 local men also lost their lives. The speed and scale of the killings stunned contemporaries. Carrickshock demonstrated that tithe enforcement had become not merely unpopular, but practically ungovernable in some districts. The aftermath was as politically significant as the incident itself. 11 local men were charged with murder and brought to trial the following year. The cases attracted national attention, with defense efforts associated with Daniel O'Connell, who argued that the defendants could not receive a fair trial given the atmosphere of hostility surrounding tithe enforcement. Most of the accused were acquitted or had charges dropped. To many observers, the verdicts amounted to an admission that the state could no longer rely on the existing system to command obedience. In practical terms, tithe collection in the Carrickshock area collapsed. The local clergyman left, and enforcement became sporadic elsewhere as well. Although resistance and occasional violence continued for several more years, Carrickshock marked a decisive turning point. The British government increasingly recognized that maintaining tithes through force was both costly and politically dangerous. That recognition led to reform rather than abolition. In 1838, the Tithe Commutation Act transformed the system by transferring responsibility for tithes from tenant farmers to landlords, who paid a reduced charge incorporated into rent. This change removed the most inflammatory feature of the system, the direct confrontation between poor Catholic tenants and the Protestant Church. While tithes did not disappear entirely, they ceased to be a flashpoint for mass resistance. Carrickshock entered Irish memory as a symbol of collective defiance against an unjust system. More than a local riot, it exposed the limits of authority when law, religion, and economic hardship collided. The Tithe War as a whole demonstrated that rural Ireland could not be governed indefinitely through coercion alone, and Carrickshock was the moment when that reality was made violently clear.